What's up, y'all? It is 5 o'clock in the morning here, and I woke up at 4, and I was like, why the fuck am I up? And I don't know why I'm up and why I can't go back to sleep yet, but I want to share this because I feel like it relates. I want to be really honest and say that I am intentionally not allowing the events of the murder of Duane, right? I'm not letting it in that like visceral way. And there are a multitude of reasons for that. I mean, number one reason is it won't help stop it, and part of the reason that I moved to New Zealand is so that I could have some control over my epigenetic response to Black death and trauma. Right? One, so that I could be someplace where it wasn't happening on a regular basis, but also so that I could have the ability to put boundaries around myself and that harm, and to not be constantly in a state of trigger and activation. And I've said many, many times, one of the most powerful things about living here is that I am on a land mass that does not have the history of my people's genocide in it. I'm on a landmass where the legacy of my people's trauma is not all up in the soil, where the blood of my people is not all up in the soil. And that allows me control over letting in trauma or not. And I'm grateful for that. I want to remind us of Toni Morrison's quote around the real function of racism is to keep us from our work. And part of the way that it keeps us from our work is by having us engage in it like it makes sense, right? Right now, I've seen a lot of responses online to the police narrative that the officer accidentally discharged their gun and they meant to tase Duane. And the whole point of that narrative is to get you to have a conversation other than the one that you're supposed to have. I want to share a little story about a time when I did that actually to the police, and it worked out well. And so it's part of the reason I can recognize it. I used to have terrible times keeping up with like car registrations and tickets. I went to jail once for unpaid ticket. I had a bench warrant, similarly to the way that Duane had a bench warrant, and I was arrested and I was put in jail for an unpaid ticket. And anyway, I had a car and the registration was expired because of the tickets, and then I didn't have the money to pay the registration. And so I got pulled over one time by the police, and I might have actually what might have happened is I might have had somebody's registration ticket on my car that wasn't mine. I might have been running that hustle. I used to run a lot of hustles around stuff like that when I was younger and trying to figure out how to live with no money. Anyway, the police come up and they're, interrogating me about my registration. And then they're like, give me your license. And I do. And the guy's like, is this license valid? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, are you sure this license is valid? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, so I'm going to run this license, and it's going to be an active license. And I'm like, yeah. And so what was happening was that the officer assumed that because my registration was bad, that all of me was right, like that everything I was doing was a lie. Right? So he went from this one thing and extrapolated to the whole thing. Right? Which isn't a terrible extrapolation, it just was an incorrect one at that time, right? And the difference between, the connection that I'm making right now is that because we look at these incidents, I look at these incidents of police murder and I extrapolate to the whole system. But that's because I have evidence, not just about this individual time, but about a pattern of behavior over time. And perhaps that officer was doing that. Maybe perhaps that officer was like, people who do this usually have this going on too. So I'm extrapolating, right? So anyway, but he was wrong. And I had a very valid driver's license. I just happened to have fucked up registration. But because he became fixated about the fact that he assumed I was lying about the driver's license, he stopped forgetting. He basically, and at this point there are 2 cops and they've got 3 cars behind me. And, there's a guy playing good cop and bad cop. If you're lying, I'm taking you to jail. It's a whole thing, right? But right now we're having the argument on my ground because the thing he's decided to attach to is the thing that I actually know I can prove, right? It's like, it's the argument I want to have because it's the one where I can, where I'm right in this case, right? It's the argument but it's the argument I want to have because it's the one I know where I'm right. And so we're not even arguing about the registration anymore. Now the debate between me and the officers about whether or not I'm lying about my driver's license. So they hold me for a cool 50 minutes, 60 minutes and go and run all my shit and come back with a valid driver's license. By the end of this conversation, the police officer is apologizing to me for thinking I'm lying and telling me how never in his career I'm the second person ever in his career who was actually telling the truth. Now, I'm riding around with some bum-ass registration, hella illegal registration. But that's not the conversation we're having because I was able to divert his attention to the conversation I would prefer to have. And I say all of that to say that is what we are looking at right now with the Minneapolis police. Is this conversation about a taser is the conversation they want you to have because it's the one you can't prove, right? It's the one that you can't prove this officer's motive. You can't prove whether the officer really meant, it's the story that's supposed to absolve them, right? And what I really want to encourage us to do is to not allow them to direct the narrative of the story. Because it's not about actually whether or not she meant to pull the taser and accidentally pulled the gun, right? It's actually about the fact that police on a regular basis are totally fine with engaging us in violence on a regular basis. Totally fine with doing the most harmful, painful things to Black bodies. It's the instinct, right? And it's the instinct because the instinct is born out of the inception of the institution. And the inception of the institution is slave patrolling. That is the inception of the institution of policing in the United States, was to catch Black people who tried to run away from their role as commodity and to violently capture them and punish them physically and return them to enslavement. And what I would offer to you is that is not different here, in this case. And so I really encourage you not to allow the police to define the narrative, to decide the terrain upon which this debate happens, because the debate is not at all about whether or not she was going to tase him, but instead shot him. The debate is why we continue to engage a police force who is willing to regularly enact violence and oftentimes deadly violence on Black bodies, and then call that protecting and serving us. Right? The argument is abolish this institution whose sole purpose is to terrorize the lives of Black and brown and indigenous bodies, because the truth of the matter is police killings in those communities are massive as well. Police killings of indigenous people, massive. Right? So that's the only purpose that the police exist in. So when they start to talk to you about tasers, stop engaging that and return to abolish the police. Defund these motherfuckers. Because until we actually start having the conversation on our ground, and our ground is, what is it that we want that is not this murderous system? That's our ground, right? That's the conversation that we want to have. That's the terrain upon which we want to have the conversation. Don't allow them to dictate the terrain upon which the conversation exists. You know? You want to have the debate about the truth. The truth was my license was valid. The truth is policing is a murderous institution that needs to go, and we need to imagine something different. That's what's true. And that's the conversation we should be having. And don't allow them to have a conversation about some bullshit. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Take care of the right family. Look for ways in which you can be directly involved. Kimberly Latrice Jones always has tasks on her page. Specific things you could do at the local level to impact. I invite you, please, to do that. But mostly I invite you to not be lured in by a false narrative put out by the police. Don't play the game on their terrain. All right. Bye, y'all.